the event is starting now, and there's like a little bit of time before anybody actually starts watching. So it gives me a little time to talk to you all or let my inner monologue go for a bit. This is going to be a really interesting one too. Right after this, I have to do a Q&A with the Filmmakers Co-op in New York. And then after that, I have to leave driving to Ann Arbor, Michigan. But it's going to be it's a Red Bull kind of day. Alrighty. So that being said, I'm going to get us going. Welcome to the 7th episode of Like Clockwork. This is a roundtable discussion where we bring Chicago-based filmmakers or folks whose practice is tangentially related to filmmaking and cinema together with regional and international artists in order to talk about what makes them tick. We have a number of things coming up at Chicago Filmmakers in the next week. The biggest item being, of course, the Onion City Experimental Film Festival, which is in its 33rd edition. And we are lucky enough to have the programmer, Nicky here with us. Chicago Filmmakers is also the producer of Reeling, the Chicago LGBTQ plus International Film Festival. We are an organization in its 50th year, bringing classes, workshops, subsidized workforce training, free workforce training in our production assistant training program. We'll also have a pretty large announcement to make in the next week and a half. It is an absolute honor to be able to bring this group of people. One of our guests will be joining us a little bit into the podcast, but of course, if you know the format for our podcast, that doesn't matter quite that much because Sara Suárez, that missing guest from our first part of our podcast, will be still here to present her topic and then to chop it up in the roundtable discussion. I will actually introduce those folks who are here. Actually, they'll introduce themselves. But Nicky, Harold, Federica are amazing members of the art community, and it is a privilege to present Nicky, the 33rd Onion City Experimental Film Festival programmer, who also has a show right now at the Chicago Artists Coalition. So Nicky, take it away.
Thank you so much, Michael. This has been a great podcast that I listened to the past episode, and I just absolutely enjoyed the conversation, and it's definitely my honor to join this one. My name's Nicky, and wow, introduction to myself. I'm originally from Beijing, and I moved to Chicago to attend school and then stayed. And then it's been maybe 15 years that I've been staying in Chicago. So it's a long time, and I'm glad to call Chicago home. I went to ICIC, School of the Art Institute of Chicago, for art history and art administration. So my background is more so like in contemporary art history. And I co-founded a gallery called Lithium. It was in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago with fellow filmmakers and artists. And then it ran for 2 years between 2017 to 2019. And then we specialized in, we call ourselves a space for time-based art. So thinking about this, gray space between the black box cinema and the white cube galleries. And then we produced monthly shows and events and stuff. But I'll stop here, and then I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to talk about further projects. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Nicky. And I'm going to pass it off to Harold.
Hello, hi. Thank you very much, Michael, for inviting me. I'm so really excited to be part of this conversation. So I'm Harold Offeh. I'm an artist based in the UK, currently in Cambridge, but I still work in London. I guess my practice is kind of defined by a relationship to performance and performativity, although a lot of my work manifests through live engagements, collaborative social arts projects. I'm also an educator, working at a few schools, the Royal College of Art in London, which is actually the school that I studied at and the school that brought me to Chicago. I did like at School of the Art Institute. I did like I think what was it, like 5 weeks. I did a 5 week class with an amazing artist called Barbara de Genevieve, who taught on the photo program. Who's like, yeah. Anyway, so I'm just having a Chicago moment, even though I'm not in Chicago, sadly. But yeah, so that's I'll stop there. I look forward to the conversation.
Oh, thank you very much, Harold and Federica.
Yep. Nice to be here with you all. I've been like creeping on your website and getting information about all of you. Like I didn't know you before this podcast. And for what I can see from there, your work is really amazing and resonates with me. I'm really glad to be here. I'm a filmmaker and a visual artist, and I mainly work with my hands. We'll talk about this later during our topics, I guess. I'm originally from Italy and I came to Canada 10 years ago. But despite that, I haven't been able to call anywhere home. As Nicky was saying, like she found, maybe I should come to Chicago actually. Maybe that's where I'll find my home. I work in experimental cinema, and my films are like tactile remediation of old scraps of old films in 60 millimeters, sometimes in 8 millimeters too. I've done my MFA in film in York University in Toronto. I found amazing mentors there. One, like my movie father, Phil Hoffman, taught me everything I needed to know about, like hand processing and working with your hands on film. And then I loved it so much that I decided to stay for my PhD there too. So I'm doing a PhD in cinema studies, trying to, and making my movies at the same time. But that's all you need to know for now.
Now, because Sara Suárez is going to be joining us in a little bit, I just wanted to speak about her for just a second. Sara is an amazing multidisciplinary artist based in Los Angeles. Sara is also one of the artists that we've showcased in Agitate. Agitate is a organization that I helped to co-found. That is a large, all-inclusive, mainly representing cinema makers, but inclusive of all artists and activists. And it was a privilege to be able to bring Sara Suárez's work to Oxford, actually, where I learned from Harold Offeh. So this is it comes full circle already. Sara's most recent work that I had seen also involves a lot of volumetric video work. And in collaboration with other artists is really beautiful. I know Sara will speak more to that and will join us later on. So before that, though, I'm going to pass it off to you, Nicky. And I know this is going to be a brilliant discussion. So thank you very much for everybody for your introductions. And Nick.
Okay. I guess, Michael, you gave us a prompt to talk about a topic, and I guess I just talk about my more or less, recent projects, and then kind of land on this idea of intimacy that I'm currently really interested in about talking about curating time-based work in expanded, situations and contexts. So I guess what interests me, like since the pandemic, was this idea of having a special relationship with screening platforms that's outside of the black box of theater, thinking about online streamings in particular. I want to brought up this example that this project called Is It a Good Time that I co-curated with a good friend of mine, fabulous artist, Mariam Faridani. Mariam, if you're listening, shout out to you because it was just a great project that was hosted by Mana Contemporary. It's this 3-day screening project that took place between, I think it was early March in 2021. And then we did a call out for artists who are non-US citizens but residing in the United States. And we will hope to showcase work from artists who did new work during the pandemic, and then thinking about how this the pandemic lockdown has basically add to a lot of difficulties and stress to people who don't have citizenship and who cannot work or move freely within the country. And it was really a success. Like, we presented it within the 3-day, linear TV kind of thing festival. It was streamed for 72 hours, and we had a lot of great responses. So that was kind of like the starting point of me thinking about, oh wow, there is this interesting, platform available online that's giving us opportunities to showcase artwork, but thinking about how we previously perceive online streaming platform as a secondary to theater streaming, in theater presentation. I was thinking about this article written by British film scholar Erica Balsam. It was published on Art Agenda like mid to late pandemic. And then, in that article, she was talking about how this is a very interesting phenomenon that all institutions were moved online and then started to present programs online. But, like in the end, we all hope to reunite in person, and then just because the medium is best to show in theater. And I totally get that point. But then I started to ask myself, how do we move beyond that? What is the best medium to show online? So I started to, research a little bit about this kind of like medium specificity of different type of showcasing, thinking about earlier video work. I'm sure everyone knows that the video work by Dutch artist Jan Dibet, he produced this little video of fire that was streamed between 1969, 68, 69 on televisions. And then, thinking about television being the center of a house, a domestic setting, and then people previously were gathered around the fires and talk about things, and then now the TV basically replaced that. And then he was trying to once again insert that fire, but in the video form into this domestic setting, and then how that can reverse or maybe add to the context of what we can think about as television. And then moving on to another work, for example, by Wendy Clark, that we all know that she did this wonderful project, One on One, which was an exchange of videotapes between inmates that were in the California Institution for Men in Chino in California. This project was around 1994. Inmates from the prison were exchanging tapes with people outside of the institution, and then they will never meet in person. They can only talk through those tapes. And then thinking about how, I was quoting a scholar, a critic who wrote about this piece, saying something along the lines of videotapes being this umbilical cord that connects two people. So thinking about like videos as potentially a means to intimacy. So this kind of brought me back to this idea of the internet-based streaming platform, and how that can create a special realm for people to really push the context of to the definition of watching and being engaged in video arts online. So I feel like there is gonna be a lot to talk about, and then I'm happy to just jump into discussions later.
Thank you very much, Nikki. I know
Yeah.
there's definitely a lot to talk about. And
Yep.
I'm taking notes as normal. And
Okay.
I'm going to pass it over to Harold whenever you're ready, Harold.
Thank you. Hi. That was great. Thank you, Nicky. Yeah, lots to discuss. Um, excuse me. I found this very difficult. This idea of trying to um, choose a particular topic to talk about, and I'm extremely indecisive. And I was trying to think about things that might be relevant, maybe to the kind of context of people that are listening in. But then I kept thinking about, there are things that are underpinning my work that maybe um, I couldn't necessarily talk about or channel through necessarily specific works. So in a way, this is a bit of a kind of mess. It's maybe indicative of, I think, where I am maybe with a few things. But I think one topic that I think I'm interested in and is of concern. And I was thinking about, if I'm going to choose something, maybe I should choose something to talk about that feels kind of urgent and relevant, and something that isn't necessarily manifested directly within the work, but I think for me is a very kind of key word, which is curiosity. Um, so that might seem slightly inane or innocuous, but um, I think I've been really interested in thinking about how um, curiosity as a methodology, as a way of engaging with the world, is something that needs to be fostered and facilitated. And I think a lot of this maybe kind of comes out of my practice and my politics. I work a lot in pedagogical learning contexts, whether that's through teaching in art schools or whether that's quite a lot of my work has been invested in working in we're working with communities, often marginalized communities, but also institutions like schools or hospitals. Been working quite a lot recently in relation to psychiatric and mental health, where I've been developing a number of artworks, often working with service users on psychiatric wards. But I think one thing that I think thinking about that's kind of underpinned that, and that's come out of experiences of trying to make work in social contexts or work that I think is speaking to certain concerns and themes, is this idea of how art practice and art methodologies, and when I say art, I'm from a visual art background, but I mean in the broader sense, culture in its very wide sense. And again, I think it's really important that people kind of have ownership of how we define these terms. Um, but and again, one of the things that I'm really concerned about, I think, with some degree of kind of urgency, is how people's ability and mechanisms to be curious are being eroded from structures, social, institutional, societal, cultural structures. And particularly, I think, within pedagogical, educational contexts, from very early on. I mean, I don't necessarily want to kind of go off on a kind of a polemic rant, which I could do about systemically the failures of the education system in the UK, but that's partly the context for what I'm trying to talk about is partly that. Um, Now, the reason I think I'm sort of really invested in this idea of kind of curiosity is that, and why I think it needs to be facilitated and fostered and nurtured, is that I think increasingly in lots of kind of cultural spheres and contexts. And again, I can only really speak from my own context, which is living in the UK, here in Europe. So it's a Western context. Although I have links to other places, but is a sense in which that we're living in an increasingly transactional, um, uh, sphere, cultural sphere, where particularly within educational contexts, really kind of key notions like curiosity, which feeds play, which feeds critical thinking, which feeds people's ability to kind of reflect and engage with the world around them, which feeds into notions of agency, which feeds into kind of notions of citizenship. You know, if we're invested in the idea of kind of liberal democracies, then curiosity is actually really fundamental to that. But people's mechanisms and ability to do that. So one of the ways in which that is happening, like I said, I'm speaking to my context, is that, you know, there's an erosion of people's ability to have access to the arts, to creativity, to creative tools. That's being removed, or it's being lessened, or it's being suppressed or sidelined. So often what I'm thinking through my artwork and really thinking through projects that I initiate or am invited to kind of participate is how to re-engage and reactivate curiosity and questioning. And I think that's something that underpins lots of artists. And again, it's something I'm interested to kind of really explore through, you know, everyone's practices and methodologies and processes, and really thinking about, you know, what goes into the work, the making of the work, but also then how the work is received, and how, you know, that process of transmitting or projecting the work out is then impacted on. I mean, it's one of the hardest things to do, I think, as kind of creatives, is to get a sense of that impact. But yeah, so just sort of coming back to me, I feel for me this is a really kind of urgent thing. I'm sort of partly interested in kind of opening this question out to seeing, is it being replicated in other contexts that people are finding, or and you know, again, one of the things I'm trying to think through is how to find strategies and approaches that facilitate and open up and create platforms, I think. But that's one way of doing it. I'm not, there's no orthodoxy. I don't think necessarily that, you know, people listening or necessarily all kind of like artists and creative people are necessarily invested in that. But I think for me, if I'm being really, really honest, I think that's what really sits under the work, is like an understanding of this, like what I feel is quite an urgent and dire situation, and then trying to kind of navigate that through through conversations, through channeling, making work. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harold. Well, there's a lot there. And also, it is absolutely, from my experience too, of what you do to others' practice and how you inform others' practice, but in also the bits of your practice that I've been lucky enough to witness firsthand, that curiosity is saturating your methodology. So I look forward to opening that up as well. In the roundtable discussion. Now I'm going to pass off to Federica, and here we go. Federica, the spotlight is yours.
Okay, so Harold, that was amazing. Like, you kind of segue into what I was gonna also speak about, and this curiosity that you are, urging us to reactivate in several ways that are mainly maybe not the mainstream ways, or maybe like this reawakening of curiosity through several different, I don't know, side ways, or side tools. For me, this came through a quote that, and that's I want to start my presentation with that. I kind of put like everything on a piece of paper because my brain goes everywhere all at the same time. So I'm gonna like kind of refer to my notes. Forgive me for maybe not looking spontaneous, but otherwise we get lost and you get lost with me. So this quote that I was reflecting upon was Godard's quote in the beginning of the Book of Image, where he says, man's true condition is to think with the hands. So I started reflecting upon this and saying, what does it mean to think with your hands? So my the thing that I want to engage right now with you and with the audience, and also through my practice, it's about reflecting. It's an invitation to reflect about what Arul was talking before, like this curiosity of the world, of experiencing the world through thinking with my hands. What does that mean? So I encountered through my research um, theoreticians and filmmakers who have sort of like shifted from the optic and so the hegemony of the eye. So mainly we are used to perceive the world and think the world through our visuals. Like everything that gets to us is extremely visual. Our intellect is wired to visual through like history of the arts, whatever, we have been set in that way. And there's been a shift in the filmmakers that I'm referencing, in the scholars that I'm drawn to, from optic image to haptic images. So the difference being, and I'm quoting Lara Marx here, I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she's quite influential. She's like really amazing scholar. You should Google her if you don't know her. The difference between haptic image and optic image. So in these optic images, there's an hegemony of the eye. The spectator or the viewer is able to absorb the image in a very clear way. It's constantly clear, the perspective. It's a straightforward image. It's all about what we've been training to do with our eyes for centuries. While the haptic image is an image where the spectator is lost. There is almost like an erotic relationship with the images. Things are not quite clear, straightforward. There's a lot of like extreme close-up. Like I'm talking about even specific examples that you can see in experimental cinema, when, for example, you get to see like the skin and you see all like the little creases of the skin, but you're not quite sure what you're looking at. So this shift for me was very interesting, to try to bring tactility into my filmmaking, not only with my hands, actually, because I work with my hand, as I said before, but also trying to train a tactile eye, which could be like a kind of counterintuitive concept. So, and therefore, I started kind of like working more and more even with my hands and trying to establish a relationship that was completely tactile. And I started reflecting upon like being unable to really feel my surroundings. Like I have my camera here, and if you think about it, like camera is a device to capture images, while the hand, with the movement and the gesture, when you're working with your hands on editing, gluing, taping, in my case, like recycling images and re-elaborating them, remediating her, it gives a different kind of gesture and a different kind of relationship to the images. So while the camera eye is capturing the image, the hand is kind of restituting the image. How do you say it in English? Like releasing the images. It's a different kind of gestures. So I went into this kind of theoretical little bit of a background for you to bring you back into the practical of my actual research. And this research started in a very spontaneous way when I came to Canada 10 years ago. So when I came to Canada, I had my camera and I wanted to capture with my eye all my surrounding, but I couldn't do it. And there was like a blockage of twofold. So the first blockage was about everything I feel didn't feel authentic to me, because I didn't belong here. I didn't like the visuals I was capturing were like not real. Like they didn't feel real to me. They didn't feel authentic. It was not resonating when I was rewatching these films. And then the other thing is more of like political, but it also political, but also subconscious, I would like to say, because I didn't feel I could come here and capture the images of a land that's already been extensively captured in the centuries to go. I did not want to repeat the attitude of past behaviors, for not saying genocide. I didn't want to appropriate. I did not feel that I could capture the images around me. So these two motivations, like one is more personal and one is more political, brought me to deal with footage of Canada that was shot before me from archives. So I started collecting like archival films. Like I know I have so many here. Like I started like buying them from auctions and stuff, and looking at the images of Canada that other people were shooting years before me, maybe Canadians, I don't know. I started editing them, cutting them, and I started actually touching the images of the landscape that I was living in. Like, I know it sounds a bit esoteric right now, but for me, when I was like looking at all these images and touching them by head and looking at the landscape on a piece of plastic against the light, it brought me into a different relationship with the landscape around me. So I started absorbing the surrounding in this more tactile way, in a subconscious way, in a way that has to do with gestures and actions. And to go back to Harold's curiosity, because I'm a curious person and I'm also leaning toward experimenting with everything, I started wondering what you can do with the plastic, like with the celluloid. What happens if I cut it this way or this other way, or if I put uh, ammonia on it, or if I put like a high oxygen on it? What if I mess up with the material? Will it mess up with the landscape around me? Like, there was kind of a subconscious process going on in my head, that whatever I was doing with the images with my hands, so maybe scratching them, cutting them, editing them, gluing them, was a reflection of my relationship with the actual land around me. So my gesture on the celluloid films were um, reflecting probably like a projection of the outside world that was actually real. So I landed onto a technique that's called emulsion lifting. And this technique is about, basically, you take two films from different film reels and you start stripping away the celluloid, the emulsion of the strip. You peel it away and then you glue it onto the other film. So basically, it's a mess to do. It's really difficult, but the process is about like actually peeling out images from one support and gluing them onto another support. So basically, you are merging two films into what, two or more films into one. This is called emulsion lifting, but I called it emulsion grafting. I don't know if you're familiar with botanical terms like grafting or graft in agriculture or botany or botanical terms, is when two plants are joined together, that they don't belong to each other, through a technique that is quite forceful. It's the man's intervention on these two plants, and then these two plants are creating a new plant, which is its own being and its own organism. And this is exactly what's happening with my films. But not only that, is what's happening to my life as an immigrant to Canada, because I'm like, the process I'm enacting and performing on the strip of film is actually quite simply the process of what I'm performing with my own life. So bringing from Italy, bringing from Canada, bringing from my present, my past, my future, all these pieces, fragmented, sometimes don't make sense. It's a fragmented narrative of everything glued onto one singular strip of film. So as I was researching, and I'm going to wrap it up quite quickly because I think I spoke for too long. As I was researching other filmmakers who work in this tradition just for aesthetic purposes, I discovered like a plethora, like a group of filmmakers who are also immigrants, who are also women, like Cécile Fontaine, Frédéric Devreux, Garineto Rossian. These are experimental filmmakers who work in exactly the same aesthetic and in exactly the same process with collage film and scraps of film remediated, re-glued, and fragmented. So this brought me to think about how, like what Judy Butler was saying and what Harold was mentioning earlier about performativity, performing, citizenship. What does it mean to be citizen in this world? What does it mean to be an immigrant? What does it mean identity? And how can you achieve identity through other ways that are more curious and unconventional? So I went back to Judith Butler when she was saying, like, an identity is not born like that. An identity is created to a repetitive performance of gestures. So this clicked with me and ticked with me about how all these immigrant filmmakers are trying to actually performing the self and performing an identity through this repetition of gestures on the celluloid of the film strip. And in this way, probably recreating themselves and their identity in the new context where they are now living and residing. So to go back to Harold's curiosity, it's a side way, it's a obliquous way to perform identity that these filmmakers and also I are arriving through aesthetic and performance. And now I'm gonna shut up because I think I spoke for more than 20 minutes.
No, I mean, you may have condensed 20 minutes worth of information into what was an extraordinary presentation, but it was not that long. And at the same time, it was full of really, really thought provoking material. So thank you so much. And I didn't mean to say material like punning. But that being said, I will pass this off to Sarah. Sarah, you now have the spotlight.
Hi, and I'm really honored to be here and meet everyone and hear from everyone. So thank you for having me. Where would you like me to start?
You can riff like the best. To be honest, I know a lot of people. They come onto the show and they have a bit of anxiety as to what it is that they're going to be speaking about. But knowing all the people who I end up inviting, there is not really a proper entry point that you can preordain. Once you start talking, I'm sure a number of different parts of your practice will come about. But I'm actually also really interested. I was talking to them about the recent film that you shared with me, but going back into your practice, I always associate your work with a sort of psychogeographical exploration, but through the cutting edge media as well.
Well, thanks. That's basically what I figured I would talk about. But I guess just to briefly introduce myself, hi, I'm Sara Suárez. I'm a filmmaker and just more generally an artist. I'm based in Los Angeles right now. And I suppose, I'm mostly working in experimental film, but also in other media. So something I'm working on right now is actually more of a video and sound and design installation project. And I've also been doing more work in photography, as well as some sound compositions and things in the past as well. And I also had co-created a community online sort of social practice creative project called Virtual Care Lab, which was really focused on bringing people together to explore like what it means to exist as a community and care for each other as a community in virtual space. So that was like a completely non-film thing, but in general, I think of myself as a filmmaker. And something I have been thinking about a lot, and I think, as you noted, is really a through line or something I'm always thinking about is what it means to relate to land and landscape and what it means to sort of be present on or to interact with a place. And more recently, where that's led me is thinking about virtual landscapes or imagined landscapes, kind of things that aren't a real physical place, and like what that means in our experience versus like the actual physical natural world that we inhabit. So recently I made a piece called Oversight that looked at images or like landscape photography in downtown Los Angeles that I shot on my own 2 feet, walking around, and then basically placed that next to the Google Earth 3D buildings view photogrammetric images of the same and related locations from that neighborhood. And that was paired with a poem written by a friend of mine, Mal Young, just she actually drew from like corporate communication documents she had for a Target, which was a strange tie-in, but they basically sound extremely inhuman. And the entire thing is about observation and monitoring and oversight. And so like something that I found myself thinking a lot through that project was just like, I would never really be against the expansion of some of these really incredible photographic imagery tools, right? But when you're sort of constructing a virtual landscape, and often I think in practical use, using it as a stand-in for a real place and understanding a real place, like what does that sort of do to our relationship to the place itself? And so like a lot of what I end up doing in my practice is throwing myself out into a physical place, right? And just observing things, shooting things, listening to things, trying to understand like the overall rhythm and pace and texture and I guess I could sense of a place and like trying to capture that. And those are the things that like are not really capturable in an objectively measured form, right? So what I am trying to convey through a lot of my photography and the way that I edit things together is like a very measured view where I will shoot things with a very, stable camera that does not move around and that is like seemingly a very objective, but it's trying to capture something that does fall through the cracks when you would like summarize a place on paper, right? And I think with previous projects that I've done, that has looked, like I did a piece in Richmond, Virginia that was really looking at forgotten and unwritten and erased histories of enslavement and formerly enslaved people along the James River area. And like those are also things that are really like, I mean, intentionally erased, right, in the sort of paper record. So I don't know where where else to go with that sort of topic, but that's like, I can talk about other projects that I've been thinking about through that lens. Or we could do a Q&A, which is sort of what I was expecting, but I'm open to anywhere you want to take it.
Well, what I tend to do is at this point in the show, I will join together everybody else's topics, so to speak, which is to say, finding all of these through lines. And for the rest of our program, we'll have essentially a freewheeling conversation where we get to continue to explore these depths together. So I'm going to actually put us into the larger roundtable discussion. Hello, everybody. Now y'all see each other. And I just want to say, first of all, as usual, I'm over here typing away, taking notes on everything that I've been hearing. And I hope that in some way I have some semblance of a thought here as I put together what I do believe are actually quite interrelated topics. And I tend to do so, of course, disclaimer. These are not always the opinions of Chicago filmmakers. Most often they are not. I am now speaking as M. Woods, and I think I'll start actually thinking about what Harold was talking about in terms of curiosity. This idea of curiosity is something that I think to some degree I had shut off myself from because I also have an aversion to what would be standardly considered fun. As somebody who's gone through a lot of bullying in my childhood, this concept of fun, or what we know as fun, oftentimes felt to me like a party environment or whatnot, and even the art community as a whole. oftentimes felt to me as being another possible situation where I'd be kicked off the lunch table, so to speak. But yet, at the same time, I was an incredibly curious child, and I manifested that through my own kind of art practice and writing practice. I think curiosity, though, as Harold is positing it, is also the curiosity of a larger cultural sense. And while I understand that you didn't say take on the role of polemicist in this case, Harold, the truth is that we've discussed many different institutions or many different media that potentially hamper this type of curiosity, especially as we are trying to dig deeper and to try to find new ways of exploring and in freeing ways. So I speak to that. I began my work thinking about nihilism and thinking about negation, particularly because of the situation in which I found myself as the son of an immigrant, not having this form of identity, as you were talking about, Federica, as well, thinking about the ways in which there was a void between myself and my projected self, and thinking that the way in which to commence forward was to actually begin to capture a sort of landscape, of a map making, a cartography of, let's say, that nothing space, of that void space. And I think that that still obviously does underpin a lot of my work and my curiosity. But there has actually been something recently, and in no small part actually due to folks like Harold, that has really sprung up in my consideration of our art practice. For instance, this being art practice, bringing a number of different consciousness is together, tying them together, figuring out the way in which consciousness can essentially affect other consciousness and our exploration. Right, this is a form of curiosity. I'm always learning more, maybe because despite the fact that I don't have a physical proximity to any of you right now, I have instead a sort of intellectual curiosity that you've sparked that allows me to continue to say flow, and maybe not in a manual way as you're speaking of, Federica, but rather that it does actually connect me far more than, say, the negating processes of transmission should normally. Um, I think that that's the form of curiosity that I found recently. It's this idea of opening up practice to not just being a cartography of the nothing or a cartography of the dismal. We've already gotten past that point. We're in the dismal. We're past the dismal. There's a sort of way in which we make art as a warning, but then once the warnings are not heeded, then we must live in a sort of time where we instead invite and open up to a space that's joyous, that's exuberant, that brings us all together, that celebrates the rarity of the consciousness that we all provide for one another. And opening that up is a vulnerable space sometimes, but it's really an ecstatic space. So I thank you all for being part of it. I do, of course, the thing that pops into my head, and it's maybe a bit stereotypical, but is Noam Chomsky's side of the debate with Foucault, and that essentially Chomsky is attempting to state that yes, we do need, the circumstances must be placed for there to be this curiosity in order to be able to develop something out of the world that can get past the institutional restrictions, as opposed to simply stating in despair that there's nothing that we can do. This stating of nothing that we can do does bother me quite a bit. Now, I take that to this sort of idea of the umbilical cord that that Nicky was speaking of. And there's something beautiful about that as well. Although I've tried to rid myself of different ways in which I thought of my own persona as being mediated, as being driven and shaped, and say a copy or simulation of mediated personas. I think that actually was at the root of my first turn of a practice. But what people like Harold actually showed me was that I needed to fold myself inside out again. When my practice was getting stale, think about every single thing that I'm doing and think about doing it differently every single time. And then that really made quite a change in thinking about distribution, for instance, in distribution models as well. There's no reason why a form of thought, I used to call it parasitic, but let's say a form of thought could be immanent in any space, in any form, and take on the contours of that form. I'm also driven by what Federica is speaking about, in part because I actually practice a similar technique to Federica, and it was my first true desire was to do work manually upon film and think about the cinematic space as being a malleable space. Although I do participate in the act of capturing through a Bolex camera, for instance, and using multiple exposure as a means of seeing things from all of these different perspectives conjoined onto one. I think that in essence, what you're also speaking of, Federica, is that there is a physical glomming on that gluing process takes on, like the emulsion lifting takes on. And although I've never gone through the process of emulsion lifting, which is far messier, I would at first take Super 8 frames and cut them up and then glue them into the 16 frames and glue them into the 35 millimeter frames. And so it actually is quite magical to be able to speak to you, especially not just on a technique level, but you're taking that technique and showing how that technique actually reinforces a deeper theoretical goal that you have in mind. And I think very much so, while mine was maybe, say, forged out of sort of brutality at first, my film An Infinite Loop for Resistance that I'm going to Ann Arbor to show, which Federica is also showing at Ann Arbor. That is certainly a brutal film from a little bit younger a time in my life. At the same time, I was interested and fascinated simply by the idea of these spaces being kind of recreated and placed together within these contexts. Now, back over to wrap it up, thinking about Sara, right? And Sara, you're a trooper too for jumping into this conversation midstream and for taking the spotlight there. But I think that you added quite a bit to it as well. The virtual landscape, the imagined landscape. I begin to think about what's the dire consequences of the fact that we now live at a time where infinite worlds actually exist now. Now, they might be tied to a sort of hardware-based system. That hardware-based system dies, the infinite worlds die, but those infinite worlds still exist. And what I mean by that is that, sure, like foreseeably, if there is a what I call the digital sickness and its physical apparatus, if this thing exists, right, to hold as a conduit, this infinite game engine, there is a world in which somebody could sit there in a game engine spinning around in circles doing whatever they want, playing with volleyballs, whatever, playing with the physics of that world. And yet at the same time, the despair of it is sometimes it's so boring. So I find that there's like this very interesting point, this place that we're at where, for instance, in thinking about what Meta's going to be doing next, or maybe laying off next, the deconstruction of this virtual reality idea, this grand concept of the ultimate media, as it were, and we're not there yet. We're always not there yet. Um, there's a sense that we also have reached a point in which these media are almost at this penultimate stage, right? And yet they deflate before they can reach this, say, almost transcendent. And I mean to state that in the most disgusting definition of the word transcend, this transcendent state, almost religious state of the ultimate art media that lays behind a possible virtual door. Yet I'm also with you, Sara, in the sense that I am never against the expansion of the technological tools towards this increasing visual exploration. And I always think that the most important thing to do is to break them as soon as we can and to make them avant-garde. And I mean, in the frontline sense, to make them militaristic. as soon as we can. So that being said, I'll end with this. My grandpapa, Edmundo, he thought of using a Super 8 camera as a means of documenting our family as an immigrant. And he came from Ecuador. And it made him extremely proud to be able to have a camera, to be able to have the ability. He didn't think of it as capturing, let's say, but he thought of it as a way of navigating, despite the fact that he also needed to, for his own survival, find methods of assimilation. And I think that image of my grandfather comes to mind as I'm thinking about everything that we've all said. This pride that he had, that he was able to work with a technology and hold the memories that he was attempting to generate and dreams he was attempting to generate for our family. So with that, I've passed it off to anybody who's got something.
Mike, you reminded me of Jonas Mekas, actually. Was a refugee to the USA, and it was like the camera for him was exactly that, the same thing that you described for your grandfather, great grandfather.
He's my grandpapa. He's over in Ecuador right now.
Wow. Yeah, and it's I was thinking about something else right now, like the accessibility of tools that Harold was talking about, in a way generates the avant-garde. Like, you know what I mean? It's like all these filmmakers that I'm studying and also the way I'm working, for me it was obviously a choice to go cameraless, etc. But there are aesthetics coming out of the lack of accessibility and tools. And these aesthetics somehow have common threads, like fragmentation, avant-garde, alternative, like they're outside of the mainstream. So when you were talking also about the virtual world and how you are like finding connection with us, being here in the same room, of course it's not something tactile, but it's something that this is your accessible tool. So you're using this tool to make this kind of artwork right now. So it's all about what people who are like on the margin of the mainstream industry can come up with the tools they can access. And I was wondering if curiosity, and I'm going to ask this question to you, like, I'm wondering if curiosity is becoming a luxury now.
That's an interesting choice of words, like a luxury. I mean, I think it's becoming an uphill battle in many ways, just because of sort of the relentless march of, demands of productivity. And like what I was talking about earlier is like, your access to a landscape, your relationship physically to it. I mean, I think that can be a luxury of time and location and everything like that. Like even now, right now, I don't have a car. And so, my ability to like drive up a mountain and shoot photos there is pretty limited, you know, uh, or restricted or, mediated in certain ways. And like, I'm basically just constantly aware of that. But I'm thinking about curiosity as a luxury. It just throws me sort of back to thinking about the attention economy. And something that I've been working on for the past few months is actually a project on dreaming. So this is what I mentioned. That's an installation. And part of what my aim through this is to sort of like create a space for people to um, explore like more open-minded imagination creation concepts in a group format. So like what this looks like as a piece is um, a series of public open gatherings that anyone can join. We've been doing them virtually, where everybody shares dreams. So it's like a collective dream sharing group. we all share dreams vocally in a discussion format, and then we write in an online collective dream journal. So it creates a sort of map of this dream territory that's shared and generated by a group of people. That shifts over hosting for events, right? And then what I'm working on now is actually transforming the written dreams into a sound installation. So we're going to do a live read where everybody actually reads each other's dreams. So it sort of removes the ownership from that, right? But like I've been kind of a lot, thinking through this project a lot about darkness and light. There's video involved, so the type of imagery that goes along with that, and then how it exists in what will be a storefront space, so open, not a restricted dark room, right? So I'm thinking about rhythms of light and darkness, and what I've been feeling for a while is really that darkness, the absence of light, uh, is a setting that for me really opens up a lot more imaginative space, where like because there's a void, because there's nothing there that's visible and sort of confronting me with an existence and a narrative right there, my mind can fill it, right? This is also what people say about sensory deprivation, which I have yet to try and I really want to. Right? But like using darkness on the screen is something I've been thinking about as well. It's something I've played with in previous works, like here and there, but I think I'm going to go deeper into that territory in future work soon. So that's just something that came up for me. And the last thing that I was going to mention about the virtual landscape thing, what's been on my mind is actually less of the sort of like video game landscapes. I don't really yet do any work in like VR or like CGI landscape design or anything like that. Though I'm curious about it, of course. But what I've been thinking about is like that imagined landscape of dreams and sort of what it means to navigate, where you're not navigating a physical landscape, but you are having the experience of navigation, right? Of moving through a place. And then in waking life, actually reporting back on that to others, right? And that's something I find myself doing in my work a lot, is like the idea of going to a place, photographing it, capturing it, sensing it, observing it, and then taking that back to others who are not there, right? And trying to sort of form or express a relationship with place that goes beyond just like that very measured or objective, seemingly objective observation. There's also real landscapes that are sort of effectively like physical or like in an embodied sense virtual to us. Like I'm thinking of outer space and the bottom of the ocean and other places that like the body cannot reach. And I'm just kind of curious about like what that relationship can look like, as well as we actually get closer, or like we have cables in the bottom of the ocean, we have satellites in the expansive space. Like there are ways that we touch these places that our bodies are not involved with, which is really interesting to me. I don't have like a conclusion, just thoughts.
No, I think, Sarah, you touched upon something really interesting, like this idea of machine sensing, because one of the program that we will be presenting at New City is called Machine Perspectives. It's something that how we think through machines, like, having machines and technology being first as the extension of our multiple faculties, not just visual, but also audio and sensing the sense of making decisions. That first being, extension of these human faculties, and then the aesthetics has changed according to that. And then we see works that are not only inspired by those aesthetics, but also comment on that and then shaped by them. And I just thought that was a really interesting point. And I just really want to circle back also to Federica's proposition of curiosity as a luxury. And then this was on my note that I really wanted to say to you, Harold, that I just thought that you mentioned that play is part of your practice, and then it's just an incredible fragile part of our community in general. And working as an administrator, I think the whole point of, you know, institutions and communities to really maintain and fight for that area where people get to play and people get to experiment. And I think the whole point of having experimental festival is so that people don't have the pressure to present something that they think is already like canonically good. Is to allow that space to even just have bad work. And then, you know, because myself, to be very honest, I'm really prone to stress. And then whenever there's stress, like, or there's like expectations, it's very hard to work towards that. And then I think being able to play is indeed a kind of luxuries as we see now. Like, you know, I couldn't really say for communities in the UK, but arts nonprofit communities in the US is very like always dire. You're in dire water. You have to fight for your own existence, and that there's constant like this fear for lack of money and lack of support. So I definitely think that that's something that me as a doing curatorial administrative work is constantly trying to upkeep and maintain. And so yeah, and then because Federica, you mentioned something about Jonas Meek, I just thought that was a very great way to talk about Onion City, because one of the programs actually inside of the exhibition called Jonas Mika's Open Archives that will be in Mana Contemporary, and it's our collaborations with Monera Foundation. And then something really interesting about the aesthetics. Federica, you talked about the fragmentation being one of the pronounced, you know, aesthetics of a certain kind of filmmaking when you're grafted into a different land and then environment. That's probably an intuitive response to the environment that you reside. And then that's kind of my takeaway from thinking about, you know, doing mostly online curating during the pandemic, and I think about how this limitation of, you know, for a period of time the limitation was that you can only access information from online, and how does that framework actually change some of the filmmaking, you know, like you see a lot of very, very intimate work. Of course this is just the limitation of making films at that period of time, but thinking about like being inside, being by yourself, looking at the outside through the windows, and then talking to oneself, and then thinking about stillness, thinking about silence, and thinking about just a lot of like loss and grief that's due to pandemic. And then for myself, for example, I wasn't able to. I still haven't seen my family for over 3 years now. It's an incredible loss and absence that we've gone through, and then how that's going to change a lot of the future body of work. And I think that's pretty interesting to see that. And then also, you know, circling back to Onion City, like the program that we are presenting at, that's part of the Jonas Mika's exhibition, is really just to address this very intimate kind of feeling, both from the filmmaker's perspective, but also from the audience perspective. It's a very small screening room that contains like 5 to 7 people. What is the different kind of experience that you might have when you are not in a bigger theater, but in a very small screening room that's like a little warm, and then there are curtains, and then there's this intimate relationship that you have with the screen, and then maybe stranger, maybe friends sitting next to you. Yeah.
I love those kinds of settings. It's like I don't really want to just go to like a very faceless like big movie theater anymore. I just want to go to like the local theater that screens, you know, experimental and curated films, and there's like I always see people I know, right? And it's like it's a community. I mean, those spaces are so valuable. And I love what you said about play too. Like that's so necessary. Um, and a lot of what we were doing with Virtual Care Lab, in that online, very pandemic informed context, right? and really just trying to like, anybody who had a creative idea could like pitch it and we would do it. And it was like a huge sandbox that I think actually generated a lot of yeah, just like community relationships and new understandings of things like care and like how to exist on the internet and all of those things. That like it was first and foremost about play, and about just like presence and being in that space and like having that openness. But then like out of that, there was like a very organic new types of knowledge that emerged, and I think that felt really lovely. Like it wasn't, uh, like a a product goal or something, right?
I want
I
to
guess
say
something.
something. Okay, you, Harold, go. You go.
Oh, no, no. Um, I'm just sorry. I'm just really conscious of really um, just how great it is really to, I think, in forums like this, really to kind of like um, get an insight into, I think, people's methodologies, people's processes, and everyone that's spoken so far. It's really, really fascinating how each of us are kind of sort of navigating, and how in a way we kind of created a kind of structure, a kind of platform for our curiosity that allows us to kind of sort of play. I mean, and I guess something I'm just sort of, I don't want to sort of necessarily keep talking about the kind of sort of structural kind of implications of that, but I think for me there's so much agency in that. That's why I just love listening to like artists, creatives, people talking about what it is they're doing, what it is they're invested in. There's something I find just very empowering about seeing people have agency, and also the kind of generosity in that I feel that's embedded within that, in terms of the desire to not only explore or find an area of inquiry, but to kind of disseminate that and spread that. And again, I think that's something that's interesting with all of you is the platforms that people are kind of creating um, for these areas of kind of inquiry. But it sort of struck me that to think, going back to my sort of curiosity thing, is that and I think Federica, your question, is curiosity a luxury? I don't think it is a luxury. I think I, you know I think most sentient human beings are curious. It's almost like a sort of state of being to kind of think about one's place in the world. It's like, why am I feeling hot today? Or I'm hungry. What's motivating that? I think for me, the difference is the structures or platforms or forums that allow people to develop that curiosity and that allow people to channel that. And um, something that I've always been interested in is why, certainly in maybe kind of the kind of anglicized Western cultures, that there's such a hostility to artists. And when I say artists, I mean just in the broader sense, whoever defines themselves, self-defining as an artist. I'm not just talking about visual art, but why is there often this hostility within this kind of, WASP, for want of a better word, like culture that, hegemonically kind of dominates still structures of capital and shapes so many forces. And and I think I don't want to over romanticize, because I'm not really so much invested in the kind of like modernist genius crap. But I think there is a kind of like threat or danger in the autonomy of that process of people not just being curious, but creating platforms and structures and mechanisms, networks, systems, um, disseminating that in the way that we're all doing that. And I'm only saying that because I think, at the moment there's a battle of narratives that's happening. I won't use that other phrase that's bandied about. For me, it's a battle of narratives. And something that this is my personal struggle, is like, how do I get a purchase on the narrative that really speaks to what it is I do? And how do I begin to find ways of speaking to others about that and sharing that in a way that is not exclusionary, is not diminishing, maybe people's opposition to that, but he's also kind of gives a sense of recognition to the ways in which we work. And I think that's often because I'm in this context of like these hostile contexts, and I think Sarah, you're talking a little bit about like this idea of kind of like battling maybe, or like as well Nicky was talking about maybe kind of contexts of organizations where there's lack of funding, there's lack of just paucity, precariousness, which sort of dominates the kind of sort of environment. But yeah, I mean, I think so I think for me it's this thing of like speaking to and also then trying to in speaking to the importance of, I think, what is often what many of us have kind of carved out is these spaces or these opportunities to really, I think, create platforms for our kind of critical inquiries, but how do we generate more of that? That's something I'm kind of interested in. How is that? And in many ways, I think listening to everyone is the work. You're doing the work. It's kind of like there's I'm asking a question and answering myself rhetorically, but and that's why I'm so really excited to hear about the ways in which people are kind of operating, the way in which I think. I mean, this is an over-bandied, like overused kind of like art speak term, but I think care, and it's interesting. But like, I think it's really great. I've been really interested in the way in which, through the specificity that everyone's spoken about what it is they're doing, whether that's curatorial projects, the materiality of working hands-on with film, really creating these like forums, thinking about imaginative landscapes, virtual landscapes, that speculative thinking that's so important, is that like care is their examples of care. That's like really important to kind of get a grasp on that. Sorry, that was a little bit of a wander around, but I wanted to come back to that because as I was listening to everyone, I was kind of thinking, oh right, this is really like that's at the heart. This is the power that's in what everyone's talking about.
I just want to second that. That was bomb. I feel like I agree with you. Like curiosity, it's sort of like the access to it or the cultivation of that may be a luxury, right? But it is there for people just like so naturally, and from when you're like born. It's kind of amazing. Um, but yeah, it is. There's like something really important about how that gets cultivated and who gets to cultivate that and how it's shaped and where you encounter that messaging. But I did also just want to point out, I think like what you said about creating our own spaces and platforms, like artists have been doing that for like ever, right? I mean, if you just look at the history, even more recently, right, of like artist run spaces, artist run projects, like we're always sort of like putting our hands into topics and ideas that we have no business knowing or trying to talk about, right? And just like sandboxing it and experimenting with it. And then like people actually end up somehow looking to that. Like it's, you know, like, oh, like it's a form of expertise. And then by that point, it usually is, but never goes through traditional routes, right? Because I think those are often very restrictive, both in terms of access and also in terms of just like the creativity and like the cultivation or tolerance of like totally wild, potentially explosive or very stupid ideas that turn out to be really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, just real quick. Oh God, there's too much. Like, I'm thinking about Gnosticism and the ideas of projecting from different spheres within the terrestrial spheres. The Gnostics believe, for instance, we're at the lowest, the darkest, the shittiest part of all of the universe, and there's something called the Great Incisions that are used in order to be able to get and achieve the next terrestrial sphere and amidst above that all is the great midst of nothingness, right? And I'm thinking about the ways in which you were talking about traversing the dream space and having a documentation of that journey. That is something that I think still binds my thinking, is this maybe ludicrous place that is beyond the visual, that is more tactile but inward, where that space exists. And yet I also think about, for instance, the ridiculous kind of quixotic journeys I took during the pandemic because I had access to a car that belonged to Aldo Tambolini. And Aldo Tambolini let me use his car so I could do one of two things. One, to track the entire King Philip's War theater. I won't go into the King Philip's War, but it was like the first war of the colonies, and it was a rebellion against the colonists by Metacomet, who called himself King Philip. And essentially, I was taking his car from there, and Aldo encouraged me, of course, to take part in the Black Lives Matter protests that were occurring in Boston at the time as well. I use that luxury of the car as a means of continuing to explore these curiosities, to see the ways in which these histories were essentially, as you said, purposefully disappeared, purposefully erased, and yet some aspects of them, some vestiges of them, were used like tourist attractions. There's fragmentation there, right? There's this, and I'm not going to go into my spicy takes on Jonas Mekas. I will say that I agree on the heart of what you're saying. I will take that though and say that that was what Tambolini meant to me. Aldo had a theater called the Black Gate. That Black Gate was a theater where he used to do shortwave broadcasts, but he would also have a space essentially without the politics of the New York scene, which I have to be very careful about as my movies are currently showing at the Filmmakers Co-op right now. But to say that there was a space in New York that he helped to develop as well, which I hold as part of his mentorship towards me, as really important. And I think as another mentor of mine, being here in Harold, and hearing Harold talk always makes me feel deeply moved, because I think of all of the potentials that art practice still does have. It's not meaningless. It's not superficial. It's not all of the things that we might be told, as you're saying, the animosity that there is towards the art or the art in general. But it's because it holds so much power still, despite the fact that, yes, you're right. There's a way in which to traverse those spaces. One must have access to some level of luxury or some level of resources. And yet when those things dry up, you're still scraping for them. And you can do very much with some minimal resources at times, and sometimes the maximal resources actually create the shit. Anyway, that's it for me.
I just want to speak back to what you are saying and Harold were saying, like you're left and right. I'm in the middle of these two minds, and yeah, that's exactly what Harold was saying. Like, how do you generate change? How do you generate opportunities? And it's in the work. It's actually, that's what I was interrogating myself the whole time, because for me as an immigrant, is especially in the beginning in Canada, it was really hard to take part in the social uh, initiatives. I was constantly scared that the immigration office come to me and get the visa from me. I promise you, like, and I was always constantly scared that, like, oh, I have to go sideways to get the other visa. Like, it, especially when I came to Canada initially, there was like a Stephen Harper era. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but it was like very bad. And anyway, so sometimes I ask myself, like, I'm not enough of an activist. I don't go in the square and demonstrate. I don't do all these things that are like on the land, like doing stuff. But then I think about what Ara was saying, is like, your politic is in the work you're making. And I think, and I believe, the more I think about it, and it's no way, like, there isn't a way to say, like, okay, activism is bad and politic of aesthetics is good, but it's like, this is there's a big value in the aesthetics and in the politics that these aesthetics bring, and all these aesthetics that are outside of the mainstream. And the more we push them towards the surface, the more they create a safe space of expression for people who are like not part of the mainstream, or like are not the privileged, So yeah, I think I really resonate what Harold was saying to me. Like, your politics is in your work, even if it's just an aesthetic, even if like anything that is pushing the borders, of the mainstream. And yeah, I really love what you say, Harold. I'm gonna be a follower, a follower of Harold.
Not just like pushing, but also just to keep what we have. I feel like capital is constantly chipping away our freedom, and then like as soon as we don't hold the ground, it's just the room's just getting smaller and smaller. So I think keeping up is already a hard work.
This is why I'm interested in dreaming, actually. Like, I was thinking of it when I first started thinking about this concept as maybe one of like the last remaining spaces that we have access to that hasn't been totally completely mediated and controlled by the government or surveillance capitalism or whatever you want to blame, right? But like, it's a space of like total agency, total autonomy, and almost like a lack of control in a lot of ways, but a very freeing kind. And yeah, I just want that. I want that space to not get invaded, right?
Now, I will say this. We have reached that point in the broadcast where we're going to go around and everyone's going to give their last thoughts. Now, you can go on for as long as you want. I'm not going to necessarily cut you off, but I will cut off the broadcast. And when I do so, I just say bye, and then we're gone. So, this moment that we have here, it will temporarily, at the very least, be lost to the recording. And at the same time, I wanted to say that it's a beautiful experience being able to talk to all of you, to see all of the different dimensions of your consciousness, as I mentioned before. I've known many of you, some of you just through writing, but many of you in person or through previous conversations. And I knew that this roundtable would be particularly, I hate to use the term as well as more art speak, but it's generative. We could go on for hours, I'm sure, and I would want to, like, deeply miss you all. But that being said, I won't leave this on a pessimistic route. I think that I agree with you, Sarah. I think that no matter what they do, they can't ever take the real dream space and the real dream fabric. And that's what bothers them so much about what some artists are capable of doing. Because while not capturing it, we're capable of manifesting something close to it or with the same energy. And that is potentially deeply transgressive, subversive, curiosity driving. And curiosity does drive one to generate consciousness where they try to keep people from being able to understand what they are. It is that level of spectatorship, that being lacking in consciousness, that they attempt to draw out. And I have gone through the experience of artwork that has leveled up my consciousness, that has sprouted something new. This conversation I'll remember for quite a while. And so I will pass this on to you, Federica. We'll go around again, and then I will cut it off.
Yeah, for me, similarly, it's been a great experience talking to you. It's really grounded me back into what matters. It's still quite isolating out here, after the pandemic, and we're not out of it, like, mentally. So it's been really great to have this space to talk. And my wish is that we continue doing our work no matter what, like at any cost, like keep doing it. And my pledge, I guess, my hope is that all of us can expand our practice to create a safe space for other people like us to express themselves. So to create these opportunities where you can feel safe to get your camera and film something and it comes out bad, that's okay. Or like you are generating a dream online and it's embarrassing, but that's okay. Like to give us opportunities to experience our mistakes and weaknesses in safe spaces that are not, how do you say, that don't restrict us into boxes.
I think that's impossible to follow for me. I just think I agree with everything that was said before, and I'm sort of currently still thinking about what Sarah's saying about dreaming and dreamers and the kind of possibility of that, and I'm sort of reminded of really thinking about the power of utopian thinking as well, and speculative thinking, like trying to imagine the impossible, and how so much fundamental change, societal change, has come from people, articulating what is seemingly impossible at that moment. And I think that's really, really important. So I'll stop there.
Me? Okay. Yeah, I second what you said, Federica. It's just an incredible opportunity for me to talk to everyone, and then just wish that this conversation can go on. But I guess I'll conclude with vulnerability. It's really something that's saying for myself, because struggling a lot with self-confidence, and then the pandemic depression is just huge, and then it comes as after waves even after this whole lockdown is over. I think I was reading something about a post that Jerry Saltz probably posted, something about like the first important thing is to be vulnerable all the time, and then think to be brave enough to show that vulnerability to people, and then to understand that everyone has that, is probably a key element to community building and to admitting care. Going back to what you say, Harold, like care is, I think, is empathy to me is only available to me when I also demand that. So like not just like me giving care, but I also need care from other people. Probably through showcasing my own vulnerability, and then that also encompasses taking risks and be prepared to fail. And then I think that's okay. Yeah, stop there.
My final thoughts here are very simple. Thank you, everybody. It's like a very genuine joy to meet you and know you and chat with you all today. Everyone should keep making things and send them to me because I like to see awesome things. But otherwise, keep in touch for real.
And so that brings us to the end of our 7th episode. I have to plug the Onion City Experimental Film Festival begins next week, but much love to you all, and bye.